Welcome to Ministries That Podcast, where I talk to successful ministry leaders about how they're using podcasting to amplify their mission and grow their ministry so you can too. I'm Tim Hall, your host and owner of Sonomorphic, a podcast production company that specializes in podcasting for ministries. My guest today is Elizabeth Santelmann. She's an author, speaker, curriculum developer, homeschool mom, and host of Sunshine in My Nest. Her hope is to share what she's learning to equip the church with accessible resources for deep spiritual growth. We're going to talk about how her first episode started out as an Instagram Live, what attracted her to starting her own podcast after growing an audience with her blog and on Instagram, and a recent experiment she tried with her podcast. So let's jump right in. Here's my conversation with Elizabeth Santelmann. Elizabeth, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Oh, I'm so excited to be here.
Yeah, so I was first introduced to you by Holly Mackle, who mentioned you a few times on our podcast, a conversation that I did recently with her about how you encouraged her to start unseriously. And you started your podcast, Sunshine in My Nest, back in May of 2022. And the description for the podcast reads, "Welcome to Sunshine in My Nest podcast. I'm your host, Elizabeth Santelmann. I hope these chats with our mentors about gospel-centered living will equip and inspire you to grow spiritually, love your family, and invest in your local community. Through the conversations with these women of faith, I've learned to pray and trust God's plans are good for me. I've grown in empathy, obedience to God's will, patience with my kids, skills to discipline my kids, and reflected on how my day-to-day life impacts my walk of faith. I pray that listening will do the same for you." So I'm glad to have you on the show today, Elizabeth, to hear about your podcasting journey. And to start off, let's take a look back at your about 3.5 years at this point in podcasting. How has having a podcast helped you amplify your mission and grow your ministry?
Yeah, I feel like this is the question, Tim, when you sent it, I had to think about the most. But honestly, it's because it's so big. I've told quite a few people that without Digital World, I probably don't have a mission in ministry, which, maybe that's making the box too small. But I grew up like super rural and we didn't really know people. I had a gift of writing and chatting with people, but those were like used in local context. And I've heard people say that you're called to something if you enjoy doing it, if there's a need for it, and if others who love Jesus affirm that gift in you. And so it was something that was consistently happening. And so it's been interesting to see like how Digital World has ended up making those type of things into what it is now.
Nice. Yeah. So how have you seen just having a podcast over these past 3.5 years becoming a way in which you can then create an audience?
Yeah. Well, it's really interesting. So we know that unless the Lord builds a house, the laborers labor in vain. But like even built into that verse, like the word labor is still there. And like, I feel like this shows up in all kinds of ways in real life ministry. Like I've watched friends support Raise to go to foreign missions or like for pastorate situations or things like that. And like, it kind of feels like it comes down to like, who like if you have money to like help amplify your mission through ads or some of those types of things, or just like having time to spend on something, but like that support network is like a built-in piece of that. And so doing things like writing a book or selling a book or fundraising for your ministry, it's challenging, I feel like, when it's in ministry, because like all of a sudden, like even I feel like I'm chattering more than I usually do because it starts to feel kind of weird or icky when you're like building in like that side of labor alongside like what feels like the noble labor side of things of like writing or like studying or some of those types of things. Or maybe it's just women who struggle with that. What has your experience been, Tim?
No, I mean, I think that's just across the board. Yeah, you just there's just a mindset that's a little bit different when you're thinking about it being a ministry. Now, granted, if you think about it, anything that we're doing is ministry.
Yeah.
But when it's, I don't know, when that's labeled that, it feels different, I guess, would be a way to put that.
Especially when a lot of the platforms that we are using to amplify ministry are also used for like self-centered like celebrity culture. And so like separating ourselves from celebrity culture, I feel like can keep a lot of people from even getting started because like you're feeling called to step into this, but you're like, but I'm not a Kardashian, or I'm not like an influencer, or I'm not like these other types of things that we tend to like tie up into all of that. And it's interesting, like one of the things that I've thought a lot about is like, what does it look like to step in and use a platform that's typically used for self-glorification to glorify God? And like, how do we redeem those portions of things to elevate the work that He's doing? And so I think untangling that for yourself and like starting to see how like using the same tools, but not in a way that like, so people who know me are probably tired of hearing me say this, but it's like instead of stepping into the digital room saying like, here I am, we had a sweet little 2-year-old who every time she stepped into a room, she would yell that like, I'm back. And so like, instead of stepping into ministry with like the, here I am, did you miss me type of attitude, like stepping into the room being like, there you are, or look at Jesus, look at what wonderful things that He's done in my life are. And like, I think as we start to untangle that, it starts to feel more glorifying to God again.
Yeah. So I was looking back and doing some research, and you first started blogging back in September of 2016, and you're posting on Instagram, and then you started the podcast in 2022. So you've been on a content creation journey for years. So tell me about that journey and your early thoughts about starting a podcast.
Yeah. So I love books, like so much. I love books. So in every podcast episode is what's something you love so much you could do an ad for. And
Yeah.
after, I forget how many episodes I've done at this point. It's been a lot of them. But for the first time a couple weeks ago, somebody turned the question back on me. And like, I was so stunned by it that I was like, well, books, obviously. Like, I love books so much and I read so much. And I'm sure that's like so cliche because so many people love reading, but I love reading, and writing is just like the other side of that kind of pours out when there's a craft you admire so much. Like a friend once told me, like, you can't help but respond. And so it feels a little bit more like a conversation as you read and then record your own thoughts as you're like processing what you're reading. And so I'd had a blog even before that, but like one that nobody read, and it's since been, I don't think you can find it on the internet.
Okay.
Hopefully you can't because it's awful. But anyway, after I had babies, I didn't really have time for long form content. So I started using Instagram to experiment with microblogging. And then that brought me into like this incredible community of women who are doing ministry online. And a lot of them were coming out with books, and I really wanted to share like and help them with what they were doing. And so that started out like sharing posts for them, or then Instagram Live became a thing. And so I was like, well, let's have an Instagram Live and like see how that goes. And so that ended up turning into, okay, because I had little kids, I wouldn't watch video content. I didn't have time for it. And so like everything that I was consuming was like audio type content. I started to notice, especially with the way social media algorithms were running, like people would see it maybe the first day if it was an Instagram post. And so we can get into later, like God, I feel like had been kind of dripping the idea that it needed to be a podcast before that. And so I feel like that ended up kind of being the kick in the pants to like get things moving. So
Gotcha. Yeah. So what was your relationship with podcasts at that time?
So it's kind of wild. I feel like I was one of the last people to discover podcasts. Like it wasn't particularly on my radar. What I wanted to do, I wanted to write like short, concentrated Bible study type stuff for people who were in seasons of low capacity, because that's just what I'd come from and felt like there was nothing. And so in the vague idea of what podcasts were, I had this idea. I wanted to like do this like short little Bible study. And I'm sure you've seen it. It did eventually happen. Like I have these little 4-minute, they're called minis that I do sporadically. And they'll run for 6 weeks, and then those take a break while the regular show continues. But I didn't really have a super clear idea on what I planned to do there. And so one of the ladies in my church, like, I'm so grateful. Like, she saw giftings and was like, you should talk to the regional director about this. And the regional director was like, I have no idea what to do with you. Like, you should talk to Karen Hodge. So Karen so kindly received my call, and she's the women's ministry director for the PCA. And she's like, after talking to you for about 30 minutes, I really think you should start a podcast where you have guests. And I should have received her advice at that moment, but since I had something so specific that I wanted to do, I just like jotted it as an idea and stuck it to my idea wall. And it was probably sitting there for like 3 years before I finally started a podcast. The only reason it went from idea wall to actually happening in that form is because a friend of mine, Ashley Hales, invited me onto her podcast to talk about digital hospitality. And I had so much fun chatting with her that I was like, oh, maybe this actually would be a good idea and I would enjoy this. So
Nice. Yeah. So when I went back and listened to that first episode that you recorded, based on some context clues, it sounded like you did just record an Instagram live and then you downloaded it and made it into a podcast episode and recorded an intro and outro. So tell me about that story.
when you said that and said that you had gone back and listened, knowing what you do, I was like, oh my gosh, this is so embarrassing that you went back and like listened to the first ones. And there's been a couple of like major hiccups along the way. But yeah. And honestly, I think it was with maybe the third live video that I had saved. I was like, gosh, like what she said was so good. Like I wish people could listen to it. And with the way that I record content, like they always say the best stuff at the end, honestly. And so it's like, this is an Instagram live, like nobody's watching to the end. Like realistically, this just isn't the way we consume Instagram content. And my neighbor is like this powerhouse. And she was like, well, you can just harvest the audio and upload it into a podcast. I'm like, no, I didn't know that. Tell me more. And so like she explained how that worked. And I had already recorded like maybe 6 of those lives. And so I know people argue over like whether you should start with like a batch all at once or if you should just start with one at a time. But since I had 6, I was like, well, I'll just like put these over here and expected like maybe 5 people to listen to that, But it didn't. Like it was more people were listening to it as a podcast than were listening to it over on Instagram. And I, at that point, had spent 5 years doing Instagram stuff. And then like in 30 days on podcasts, like it was already like outperforming the Instagram. I was like, well, like there must be something here. And so I kept just doing lives and then converting it over. And at some point, like authors aren't always people who are super comfortable in front of a mic and a camera and doing live. And so there were some people who I wanted to chat with, but I knew that was just not going to be the best format to visit with them. So I started doing these things called exclusives, and those were just podcast content. And so then there wasn't video that accompanied it, and like we could just relax and chat a little bit before, a little bit after. I think I actually started editing the audio when it was still lives because there were certain things I was just like, well, this is funky and this is weird, and I'm just going to like do. And that started because my husband, he's so precious. Like when he was in high school, he wanted to edit out like the bad words of some of his favorite music. And so he found Audacity. And so he just like beep boop. And so he's like, yeah, I think you could do that and just like cut this part and like put your intro and outro in through this. Cause like the thing is like, if I was going to have a podcast, whatever it was, it had to be free. And so like originally there was no mic involved. And so like podcast had to pay for what podcast was going to take. And so like then as time passed, like mic happened and some of those other types of things. But yeah, it was, I don't know. I feel like that is kind of a funky way to come over to podcasting.
No, but that's interesting too, that you were presented with that idea and you're like, okay, let's figure this out. Tell me a little bit about what it took to go from, okay, well, I do have these recorded. I guess I could put it as a podcast to actually getting them published and then going back and seeing, hey, people are actually listening to these.
Yeah. So I can't remember the name of I may actually still have it just up here. Oh yeah. It's called Instagram Downloader. It looks kind of like a scam, but like if you put the URL into it, it makes a video, and then I was able to convert it into an MP3. And Tim, you're going to laugh at me. It was so like I just used Spotify, made a profile, and at that time,
Yeah.
Spotify would give you music. So I just picked
Yeah.
one that kind of sounded like me and like recorded a little intro for it. And so it was like literally like because I didn't know if I wanted to spend time doing this. So it's like I don't want to invest a whole bunch of time on something I'm not sure that I'm going to stick with. But yeah, I don't know. So I did that and uploaded it, and the rest is history, I guess. So
Nice. So what led you to decide, you started doing this kind of on a whim, maybe this will work, maybe this won't. You start seeing some results of like, oh, people are actually listening. What was that kind of point in which you're like, oh, I should probably take this seriously and like actually start planning these things out?
Yeah. And I really hope this is encouraging for somebody who's like, I don't have the technical know how to do some of this stuff. Like, you can do it all wrong. And it can, like, again, when the Lord is the one building the house, even when you're laboring all wrong, like you can learn along the way and it ends up okay. So, or you find out it's not your cup of tea and you can move on to something else. So, yeah, I think it was after I started doing those exclusive episodes that it was like, okay, the podcast is now its own thing. And it wasn't long after that, because then the exclusive episodes performed even better than the ones that I was going live and then doing it. And I don't know, there's just something kind of fun about like, this is exclusive to here. Like you can't get it anywhere else. But then I started creating content exclusively for the podcast. But then like there ended up being, as I started taking it seriously, I made some mistakes along the way that I'm going to tell a little bit about in order to maybe save somebody else from that. So one of the ways that it can be kind of easy to get guests and people who you enjoy talking to is as people's books started coming out, I found out they're all assigned a publicist. And so a lot of times it would really help them with scheduling, especially when you're scheduling people who have really busy schedules, to like just ask for their publicist's email, and then the publicist will find out if they have time for that and if they have space and like what time would work best. And like they'll do all that behind the scenes work for you. Well, once a publicist ended up having my name for the podcast, like all of a sudden, like it was also happening in reverse, and they were pitching all these people who I didn't really know to come be guests on the podcast also, which was great because a lot of times it was people who absolutely, yes, this is like in alignment with my mission and my ministry and would be a great help. It was good. But then the other side of that is I think I got a little bit carried away with that and felt like there was some level of obligation just because a book from a publisher showed up at my house, that then I needed to help amplify that message, even if it wasn't necessarily in alignment with the women who I was serving or the topics that we typically looked at. And so in about year number 2, there was like a little bit, I feel like, of waffling, like trying to figure out like what that footing looks like before really finding consistency of like, no, like this is what I do. And like there's other places that those books will thrive and it will serve somebody, but like this is really at the core what I do. So
yeah. No, I feel like I've heard that many times of like people start reaching out and then I have more guests than I'd probably need. And now I have to make these decisions, and what should my filter be, and how do I set that? Like I ran into that when I produced the Entree Leadership podcast at Ramsey Solutions. Like we would get so many pitches, and it was like, okay, how are we going to have this person on to best serve our audience? And then it was like, okay, maybe we don't have them on, or there's just that whole process that you go through. It feels like, I don't know, I've talked with so many different folks now on this show that have had a similar thing of like, they start getting a lot and then they're like, okay, who am I actually trying to serve here? And try and have a refocusing, and it's always super beneficial.
Well, and then at the beginning, there's kind of that panic, especially for a week-to-week podcast of like, oh my gosh, I just have to say yes to everybody because I have to fill the spots. And like, I've actually not found that that's the way that it works. Like, it's one of those cast your bread on the water type things. Like every time, like if there is an opening, it hasn't happened yet in 3 years that there doesn't end up being somebody who there's an interview there to fill that spot. And so for a while I was batch editing Oh, this is where my embarrassing story comes in, Tim. I
Yeah.
was batch editing. I recorded 6 episodes like in a couple of days worth of time,
Mhm.
and I just had to switch platforms and didn't realize that because in the other one, it automatically, if you plugged your mic in, it recognized the mic. And then I switched to Riverside, and you have to manually select that.
Mhm.
And all of those episodes were with guests that I was so excited to have on and that had no space to re-record. And all of them were recorded with my computer audio. And
Oh,
it was
no.
absolutely devastating. And like the audio was so bad. It wasn't just like a little bit bad. Like there were times like I would go in and like try to record like we were having the conversation and like, tell me more about XYZ, like behind, like later and try to like clip
Mhm.
it in and make it
Yeah, yeah.
happen. But some of them, that wasn't even, it just wasn't possible. And so you can still probably find, I don't know, maybe I should like remove those from existence. But yeah, I learned double, triple check your mic every time. So
Yeah, that sometimes sneaks in there, that it's easy to miss that and be like, everything sounds good. I'm hearing everything. Everybody
yeah,
sounds good. And then you don't realize
you don't
um,
sound good.
that you don't sound good. Yeah. And so, yeah, that's why it's helpful when you have the opportunity to be able to monitor yourself while you're recording and you hear that. I was like, wait, that's not what I'm supposed to sound like right now. That's always helpful. But yeah. And the great part is now, and I don't know if when you recorded those, if this was even an option, but Adobe Podcast is a thing now, as you might know, that you can upload your audio into and it does AI processing. And I've had clients that have unfortunately had that same issue that they've recorded with the wrong mic or didn't have a mic or
Yeah.
for whatever reason, something came up and it has helped resurrect some very bad audio for some episodes that have may not have gotten published otherwise. And so that's a great tool that Adobe has that you can throw stuff in like that now. But yeah, what other challenges did you face as you were getting started in podcasting that you didn't anticipate?
So when I started the podcast, it seems like longer form content was more popular. And like I said, I was at a stage of life where like my kids were pretty little or just coming out of a stage of life where my kids were really little. And I knew then I didn't have a ton of time. And so I was like, where are the podcasts for those of us who just have 15 to 20 minutes to listen to something and we want to feel encouraged, but we don't have space, bandwidth, time, whatever. And so I constantly was like, why doesn't anybody have a shorter podcast? And then in trying to start a shorter podcast, I realized like, oh, because if you like want to get to the meat, like that's a lot on the producer. Like you have to like figure out how to line up your questions. So you just like dive in and get to the root of things quickly. And you have to figure out how to make your guest feel comfortable right away, that they're okay with jumping into like some of the people who come on are like sharing about really hard things that have happened to them. And like, how do you go from like, tell me about your stage of life to like, tell me about this really awful thing that happened to you and your family and what God did for you through that. And so I pretty quickly learned like I was going to have to come up with like, there wasn't time for more than 5 questions. Like 5 questions is really what I have space for. And so like, how do I need to formulate those questions so that by about minute 7, we're to the meat of what we're going to talk about? And I think trying to figure out that formula, it took more work on the front end. And I feel like now that I've been doing it for a few years, like it comes a little bit more intuitively. But at the beginning, that was something I ended up spending quite a lot of time on that I wouldn't have expected heading into that originally.
Yeah, totally. I mean, that's a great point. Yeah, doing a shorter episode can actually be harder in some ways, like you're saying, because you have to try and refine it and get to the points that you're wanting to do, or you record longer and then you got to cut it down and make those decisions later.
That's had to happen too. Like sometimes we do record a 30-minute episode and like I was and have been so committed to that 20-minute thing that I will put the work in behind the scenes in order to help bring it down in and fine tune it to like really honor the listener in that way.
Along your podcasting journey, you started the podcast, you're still blogging, you're still posting on Instagram, obviously, and then you started developing curriculum and you're homeschooling your boys. And so what role did the podcast play in all of those areas of your life?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think at the beginning we were kind of talking about the weirdness of social media. Like, there's a lot of ways you're kind of at its mercy. Again, I don't know if this is for everybody or if women kind of uniquely struggle with the like whole influencer culture thing or getting like, I feel like the word influencer and blogger almost feels like a bad word in some ways. And so being able to have a podcast, I feel like it ends up being able to allow for deeper conversations
Yeah.
and relationships and just like kind of building more trust, I think, than what you can do in snippets. Like Instagram is really good for like snippets of content, and we can build a little bit of that trust in that way. But I feel like we're just able to expand on that more with podcast content. And, maybe it also shows people sometimes that I'm not their cup of tea, which is also okay. But I think it just is a little bit more like having a friend over for coffee. And some people, you have them over for coffee and then you never see or hear from them again. And it's like, okay, well, this just was not my right type of person. But also like having people over for coffee also allows you to share more deeply with that person, and you can end up getting to know them a little bit better. So,
yeah, that's what I love about the medium of podcasting is that there is just that relational aspect of, as a listener, you're overhearing a conversation, you're getting to be a part of it, but not being there, and you can listen to it whenever you want. But yeah,
Yeah.
you get to feel like you know the people, and it's a great medium for that. Whereas, like you're saying, on social media, you're swiping through, you're viewing 10 different people's content in a minute or less, very
sure.
easily. So, as you've gone on this journey, you're into it now 3.5 years. What have you found to be fun about podcasting, and then what do you find not so fun?
Oh gosh, Tim, I could actually probably just do an ad for podcasting because like I love conversation so much. Like in real life, like I have friends that joke and say like if conversation is steps, like I like to start on the third step, which I think is why this format has worked so well for me. But then also I love editing. I love hearing people's stories. And yeah, as to the not so fun thing, so one of the things I told Holly from one of your previous episodes, like multiple times before she started her podcast, I was like, Holly, literally, like, what's the worst thing that could happen if you start it and then you don't like it? There's no downside to giving it a shot. Like, it's like you try it, and if you like it, great. If you don't, it's just information. And so I don't really feel like there's a downside to starting a podcast. And that's coming from the person who probably did it all wrong from day one. So,
but you adapt, you learn, you grow, and you just keep doing it.
That part, yes.
Yeah. Yeah. What have been some of the best byproducts that you've seen from having a podcast, opportunities that have come up?
Well, I feel like it's really helped, like, as you have conversations with people, like, I'm getting to have conversations with the people who I admire most in the same sector that I feel like God is calling me to. And you can't have hours of conversation with people who are just so good at what they do, I feel like, without learning things from them. And some of the behind the scenes conversations before we hit record or after we hit record are even better than what happens in the podcast. Like, I feel like people who are in ministry are really quick to like drop hints and tips to each other and to like be like, yeah, XYZ was great. And like, maybe this would help it be better. And so I feel like it took something from being like a DM community to like a recognizing face-to-face type of community. And I feel like that's probably been the biggest benefit to podcasting. And then, so I was a children's ministry director before I ever got married and had kids. And so like I had to prepare and speak in front of a bunch of people every week, multiple times a week. And so like it's a skill that you have to sharpen. And so I feel like in podcasting, like it's also kind of helped keep that something that I enjoyed doing a little bit sharp. It's different when it's in conversation. And sometimes there's still a little bit of like stop start when it's not in the podcast format anymore, just because it's different. But I do feel like it's also helped sharpen that as a skill also.
Nice. Yeah, for sure. So I'd love to jump into something that we messaged back and forth about before we scheduled this conversation. And that is that you were listening to some previous episode on this podcast with Paul Colligan, and he was talking about how the Apple Podcast charts work and the steps that you can take to really help jump up in the charts. And you went and were like, hey, I'm going to try this thing. And so share with us what you learned from that experiment and how it played out when you tried it for yourself.
Yeah. Well, so I think you've probably gathered at this point, I'm a very curiosity-driven person with all these platforms. Like, I wonder what it would be like to have Instagram. I'll check it out. What would it be like to have podcasts? Check it out. And, email list and figure out what's fun and what's not fun. And so my friend Holly was like, hey, Tim just interviewed me for this. And like, I said your name, like he might message you. And so I was like, well, I guess I need to figure out who Tim is. And so I listened to her episode and I was like, you mentioned a couple things, I think maybe from a previous episode. And I was like, oh, that sounds really interesting. I want to go find that. And so like ended up going back in the archives and listening to different episodes. And one of the episodes was about how Paul would so he was talking about it from the context of like when it's a brand new show, getting a brand new show onto the charts. And I was like, well, maybe this is stupid. Like I've had this podcast for 3 years already. Like there is no like day one hype that's going to happen because day one is long past at this point. But I wonder if I just did all the steps he said, like I'm just curious what would happen. And honestly, I have the sweetest community. Like I know some people talk about getting podcaster hate mail and all this stuff. Like I've never got podcaster hate mail. Everybody's just so kind. And I have no idea like how that's happened, but I feel so grateful. So I had thought about doing it and then a bunch of stuff came up, but I didn't realize I had already written into my email that I was going to do it. And the email went out on a random Wednesday and I read to make sure all the links worked. And it was like, oh yeah, I was going to do that today. And so I was like, all right, well, I guess we're doing this today. And it was a little bit vulnerable because it's like, if you ask people, you're like, let's see if we can get on the podcast charts today. It's a random Wednesday. And then you don't, like, there is a little bit of like, oh, well, that was uncomfortable. But I was like, you know what? Let's just back to what I told Holly, literally what's the worst thing that's going to happen? Most of these people don't know you in person and they're probably, if they see you at a conference, not going to come up and tell you how, oh, remember that time you failed to get on the podcast charts, right? So I was like, all right, we're just going to roll with it. And so I, in stories, invited my Instagram community to participate. I have some broadcast channels on Instagram. I was like, hey, this is what I'm going to try to do. Like, let's see if we can do it. And then I created like a little tiny podcast mini and so that way it would show up randomly for people there. I always publish on Tuesday. So getting something on Wednesday was going to be like, oh, whoa, what's happening here? This is not Tuesday. Yeah. And so it got a ton of listens and people started sharing it with each other. And then I followed his advice of going ahead and sending out another one at noon. And I serve at our church's students, so I knew an evening email wasn't going to go out. And so I just went ahead and I was like, you know what? I also still have to do my housework and homeschool my kids. I feel like we've covered our bases. Let's see what happens. And so afternoon started going and nothing. And I was like, well, that was embarrassing. Went to church. And when I came home, it was on the charts. And so I told my husband, I'm like, oh my gosh, it worked. 3 years later, it still worked. All of the advice, I guess it works really well because even after all that time. Yeah. And then it just kept climbing. So then at that point, I messaged the broadcast channel and I was like, a couple more steps and we'll go past the astrology podcast. You want to make that happen? And so then I think a bunch of people sent stuff to friends and we went up past the astrology podcast. So yeah.
Yeah. So where did you end up? The height of it when you did that?
I think it got up to it was right around 100, I think, which nice. I mean, for us, my Instagram is fairly small. I feel like I have a lot of loyal people, but it's still a small account in the scheme of things. And so to be able to do that again on a random Wednesday is kind of fun. So
right. I mean, you don't have to tell me the exact numbers, but from my experience, I know that means hundreds of people hit subscribe.
Yeah.
On Apple Podcasts, they went and they hit the, technically follow button on Apple Podcasts, and all did it within that 24-hour period that Paul's talking about.
Yeah.
And because of that, the way that Apple's built their algorithm for the charts that still hasn't changed. And I can't remember how long he said, but over 10 years
Yeah.
at least, it still works. And so it's cool to hear that you're like, hey, I'm going to just try this and see how it works and see the results of it. Yeah, I remember doing that with another client that I was helping start their show, and it was a similar thing. We were pushing for it. We didn't see anything change yet, and then all of a sudden, I think they had gotten up right around 100 as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so just with some dedication and reaching out to your different audiences and having that all focused, it works.
Yeah,
It was great.
and the big thing is just willing to be vulnerable. Like, they're
Mm-hmm.
already listening to your voice every week. Like, that's something that builds intimacy. And I feel like sometimes, like, it is a really unique position, especially for those of us. I think everybody I've listened to on your podcast, they're the scrappy kind of person. Like, if there's a job, they're going to get it done. And it's not necessarily about like trying to make God love them more or try to achieve something, but more just like, you know what, like, this is what's been put in front of me and I'm going to do it as faithfully as I can. And so, like, there's something really weird for those of us who have that type of personality to have something be entirely out of our hands. And that's the really weird thing with Paul's method is, like, as the person who's the host, it's really out of your hands and it's in the hands of the people who listen to you and love you or care about you. And like, they do it or they don't do it. And yeah, it's just a very unique position, but kind of worth the vulnerability. So
Yeah. So for people listening that aren't familiar with how the Apple charts work, basically the overview is, and you can obviously go listen to the Paul Colligan episode.
I encourage
but,
it.
Yeah, the overview is that basically how the charts work is the number of people that hit follow in a 24-hour period. And so the people that are staying at the top of the charts are people that are constantly, day in and day out, getting hundreds, if not thousands of new people hitting follow, which is nuts.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, when you start a podcast, if you have a big rush of people that are all, you do a coordinated marketing effort basically on doing that, you can easily get up on the charts, and it just acts as a billboard mainly, that people see and are like, oh, people scroll through the charts, are looking for different shows, and you very well could hear from somebody a year from now that I was just scrolling the charts and found your podcast, and it's tied back to this moment. Some neat stuff like that. Elizabeth, who were some people that you've learned different things in podcasting, and what did they teach you?
Well, like I said, in the moments before and after recording, like, there's been a lot of really helpful voices. One was Asherita. She has the Prayers of Rest podcast, and she helped me figure out like what mic to get. Like I said, my neighbor was like, you just need to convert these audio files. My brother-in-law helped. So Spotify eventually quit allowing you to use music on your, like, they stopped hosting that part of things. And so I was like, well, now I've got to have an official situation. And so my brother-in-law is really good at music. And so he, like, in 5 minutes composed like a little thing to go underneath my intro. And so we recorded that. And then, like, my husband introduced me to Audacity. And you were talking about Adobe. I still just use Audacity. Like, it is, like, it's free. And yeah, it just like trying to keep the budget really low on all of it has been really helpful. Like, again, the podcast has to pay for what it takes up. So yeah.
Get that. All right. So what are you excited about for the future of your ministry and the podcast?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's hard to tell what all is connected to what. I have a book coming out, though, this next year. And so it's probably podcast in connection, like, with all the other breadcrumb trail that's been connected. But I mean, I do think like the podcast and like really learning how the industry works and like how some of these things like come to be helped me be more comfortable with the process of pitching a book and going through that entire process. So that's a lot of fun. Yeah, I don't know. I feel like there's always, like, especially as a new year begins, like, there's this sparkle of curiosity of like, okay, like, who's it going to be this year? Like, because sometimes you don't know that all in advance, and you can have ideas of who you would like to have certain conversations with. But I feel like just that you never know what's going to happen when you have a podcast is a lot of fun. So
yeah, nice. All right. Well, we're going to jump into the high pass segment now where we ignore the lows and I ask you about some of your favorite things. So, first question. What's your favorite thing that you grew in your garden this year?
Tim, okay, so I said I have a book baby that's about to happen this spring. I was like, we can either have a garden or we can have a book. We can't have both. So I love gardening. And I did dump, I harvest my own, the blossoms off of zinnias. And you can crumble them back out as seed and they grow new. And so I had 2-gallon bags of zinnias. So all of my dirt was filled with zinnia seeds this year. It was beautiful, but there were no vegetables that happened at all. So the garden baby got neglected.
All right. What's your favorite hot drink this fall?
Probably a latte. Lattes are so good. It used to be tea, but now it's pretty exclusively coffee. That probably came with the third child. So,
all right. Well, what's one of your favorite stories from a listener about how Sunshine in My Nest impacted their life?
Yeah. So I mentioned that I do the minis and they're little Bible studies. It's a single verse and I tell a little bit of a story of why this verse is meaningful to me and then give the context for the verse. And they run in little 6-week chunks and I hand paint verse cards to go with it. And my favorite message was from this lady in Ireland who she and her Bible study group were all doing them together. And so it's just oh my gosh, this little podcast in Oklahoma is part of a Bible study in Ireland. And she was just talking about in their rural area how hard it was to find resources. And so having something entirely printable and then they could all listen to it together was just super helpful to them. And it made me so happy.
Nice. Yeah, that's cool. All right. Well, as we close our episode, Elizabeth, who else do you know that would be a great guest for this podcast?
Okay, so I think I mentioned her a couple times. Ashley Hales has been a lovely mentor to me for probably 5 years now. And she was the producer for Russell Moore's show. And she and her husband have their own podcast called The Cartographers. And she's the one who invited me on as a guest. And by the time I was done with that, I'm like, well, I am sold on podcasting. This was a ton of fun. So
nice. Well, I'll have to look that show up. And thank you for that recommendation. Thank you for coming on the podcast today and sharing your podcasting journey. I really appreciate it.
It was so fun to chat with you today.
I really enjoyed getting to hear Elizabeth's podcasting journey and how she took a friend's advice of downloading her Instagram lives and uploading them as a podcast episode has become a key part of her ministry. And she just continues to learn and try new things like the Apple Podcast charting experiment we talked about. You can listen to Sunshine in My Nest with the link in the show notes. Well, that's going to do it for this episode of Ministries That Podcast, produced by Sonomorphic. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to follow or subscribe to the podcast and share it with a friend. That's the best way to support this show, and together we'll help more ministries grow and thrive through podcasting. Now come back in 2 weeks for the last episode of the year where I'm going to be highlighting some of the best podcast advice and favorite moments from Ministries That Podcast this year. You don't want to miss this special episode. Well, until next time, happy Thanksgiving and keep encouraging your audience as they follow Jesus.